Welcome to Crossroad Connection. We're speaking out for those left unheard. My name is David Schuringa, the host of the program, and I'm also the president of Crossroad Bible Institute. There's usually a lot of controversy around the death penalty. Christians are a bit divided on it, and our country is. But we have today in the studio with us today someone who's been studying this issue in depth, and her name is Heather Bedouin. Welcome, Heather, to the program.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
And Heather is a national organizer at Equal Justice USA, which is located in
Brooklyn, New York.
Brooklyn, New York. Okay, so you've come far away from home to our fine city here, or you said actually you are housed. Your office is housed here.
Yes, that's right. Yes, I get to work from Three Rivers, so just south of here. So I get the best of both worlds. I get to travel to New York a few times a year, but I get to live here in Michigan, which I love.
Okay, and tell us about Equal Justice USA.
Yes, so we are a national nonprofit organization. We focus on criminal justice reform, and our main focus has been ending the death penalty.
Okay, so you're putting it right out there for us.
Yes.
That you guys are out to end the death penalty.
Right.
Are you would you consider yourself a Christian organization or a secular organization or what?
Yeah, we are not a faith-based organization, though we definitely do a lot of work with faith communities. And I myself am a person of faith, and most of my work involves reaching out to the evangelical community across the country.
And what have you been finding as you reach out to the evangelical community and saying that you want to get rid of the death penalty?
Sure. Well, I started this work about 5 years ago and was hired actually to do this work in Montana at a state level to reach out to conservatives, evangelicals, and law enforcement. And I was pretty terrified, I think, at the time about, how I would talk with folks who traditionally maybe support the death penalty. But in the last 5 years, I can honestly say that I've been completely blown away, especially by the evangelical community, when it comes to the openness on the issue and the common ground that we can find. Folks are concerned about the way that the death penalty is being carried out in this country, so there's a lot to talk about.
So you're finding people, this is getting on people's radar. What do you? Let's just have a little bit of fun here.
Sure.
Okay, so an evangelical Christian, and I consider myself an evangelical Christian, but most commonly they will point to Genesis 9 verse 6, or is it 6 verse 9? 9 verse 6, I think, where it says, "If you shed a man's blood, your blood should also be shed." Romans 13 talks about the government having the power of the sword to, as an agent of wrath for God. What do you do with this seemingly insurmountable biblical evidence for the death penalty?
Sure. Well, first of all, I think it's important to point out that that obviously the death penalty is in the Bible. You know, we don't deny that. But I think it's important to look at what the biblical death penalty looks like and what the American death penalty looks like. And they do not look alike at all. And in fact, the Bible mandates, I think it's about around 45 different things that the American death penalty does not. So one of those is that in a death penalty case in the Bible, there need to be 2 eyewitnesses present at the time of the crime. That's obviously not mandated in the American death penalty. You cannot convict someone on circumstantial evidence in the biblical death penalty. You know, we don't abide by that here in the U.S. And so I think it's important to note that they don't look alike. We have lots of biblical scholars, I am not one of them, who study the text and say, that they sort of see that the death penalty is allowable in the Bible, that God allows for the death penalty, but that it's not a mandate. And so that's a perspective that I would say that I share as well.
Okay. Well, we can talk a long time about the theological aspects
Absolutely.
of it, I suppose.
Sure.
But of course, they had death penalty for Sabbath breaking and for disobedient children and
Definitely.
for homosexuals. So it was a whole different sort of thing. Do you think that the death of Christ should be perhaps a lens that we see some of those texts through? Because I don't see a lot of payback in the New Testament. I do see it in the Old Testament. Have you thought along those lines at all?
Absolutely. And many folks have asked, can we envision Jesus as an executioner? Can we envision Jesus, pulling the switch on some of these executions? And frankly, I cannot. And a lot of times we point to the example in the Bible of the woman who was caught in adultery, and how in those times she was absolutely eligible for execution. But he said, those who are without sin cast the first stone. And that was, he could have made an example of that and said, yes, let's execute her, but he didn't. And that's much more in line with the Jesus that I know than someone who would say that he would be for execution and be excited about that and pull the switch.
Now the state of Michigan has, I think it was one of the first ones to
That's right.
Dispose of the death penalty, and I think that's even before it was a state.
That's right. Yeah.
And so that has not been an issue here for us. Texas and Montana are it's another issue, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
So how are you approaching that? Let's say in Texas.
Yes, I have a lot of respect for the folks who are working on the ground in Texas, because it's not easy. But again, we all have reason to be concerned about the death penalty. There are folks who've been convicted in Texas and sentenced to death who've later been proven to be innocent. There are major problems with all sorts of things in Texas with the way that they carry out the death penalty. And so folks there are able to start having conversations, I think, even with folks who've traditionally supported the death penalty, to sort of say, well, what are we doing here? There was a case of Cameron Todd Willingham a few years ago, and he was executed for arson. They said that he set his house on fire and his 2 little girls were inside. He was executed for that crime, and I'm not claiming now that he was definitely innocent, but a variety of forensic experts have gone back and looked at his case and said, the evidence that he was convicted on, this fire science evidence, was complete junk science, and that there's a real possibility that he was innocent.
Certainly not convicted beyond a reasonable doubt.
Right, absolutely. So that's a problem. So I think there are, no matter what state you live in, we can talk about problems with the death penalty and concerns that we all should share, even if you support it as a philosophical idea, which I talk with a lot of folks who think the death penalty is a great idea, but they're pretty concerned about the way it's being carried out in our country today.
So would they be so concerned about innocent people being executed that they would favor a moratorium on it until it gets settled and can be applied in a just manner?
I think some are at that point. Not everyone, obviously, but I think we're moving more in that direction. And I think even when I started this work 5 years ago, I've always been passionate about this issue and always felt like there shouldn't be a death penalty. But if you would have asked me if I really believed that innocent people were convicted and sentenced to death, I probably would have been a little bit. I might not have thought that there were as many people convicted as there are, over 146 people since 1976. And so I think more and more we're seeing these stories come out. I mean, I think it's no longer a question, do we convict innocent people and sentence them to death? It's a reality. I mean, you look in the news and it seems like it's happening frequently. So I think it's becoming a more well-known concern, and folks are starting to wake up to the realities that we have a broken system.
A hardcore response to that would be no system is perfect and there's going to be collateral damage.
Sure, except when you're dealing with a system that involves life and death, we need to have pretty high standards. If we're talking about a sentence of life without parole, at least you can release the person. If you later find them to be innocent, with a death penalty, you can't release them from the grave. So that's something we need to take seriously.
Right. No, that was a good answer. I was setting you up there a little bit, but I have heard that argument.
Certainly.
What I want to talk about after the break is the fact it seems like there are a lot of poor people on death row, and people of color.
Absolutely.
So the question I have to ask you: why do people of color kill so many people? We'll be right back after this.
Research shows that people in prison who participate in faith-based programs during their incarceration are dramatically less likely to go back to prison after their release. Crossroad Bible Institute provides biblical instruction for tens of thousands of people in prison. You can participate in this ministry by correcting Bible study lessons, donating, and praying for CBI. Go to cbi.fm on the web for more information.
Welcome back to Crossroad Connection. I'm David Scheringa, and I'm here with Heather Bodwin. Before the break, I mentioned that it seems like there's an awful lot of people, there's a disproportionate number of people of color and poor people that are on death row. Mm-hmm. And I kind of baited you a little bit, but the fact is that I have heard people say, the reason that a large majority of people in prison are people of color and so forth, and poor people, is because, well, they commit more crimes, which is a pretty frightening answer.
Yeah, I would
but let's
agree.
talk about that with the people on death row. They happen to be people who are poor or people of color. Mm-hmm. Do these people just have a propensity for killing people?
Absolutely not. No, you bring up a great point, and that is that I often hear, well, we have to have the death penalty for the worst of the worst, and for these serial killers and these monsters out there. Okay, those are not the folks who wind up on death row. Mm-hmm. Frequently, it's people who can't afford their own attorney. If you can afford your own attorney, chances are you are not going to get the death penalty. And also, a really astounding fact that I have learned in terms of people of color is that if you kill a white person, you are much more likely to get the death penalty than if you kill a person of color. Mm-hmm. So that's a pretty startling message that we're sending in terms of the value of human life and whose lives are worth more than others.
The correlation seems way too strong to be able to dispose of it, doesn't it?
It does, definitely.
That is true. If you get the right attorney, mm-hmm. Governor Snyder just recently appointed me to his Indigent Defense Commission, mm-hmm. and we're meeting on that, because Michigan, for one, has a horrible record in terms of being able to appoint proper legal counsel for someone who is poor, mm-hmm. and that is actually what I'm finding. It's a huge problem throughout our country. Mm-hmm. That poor people are not getting their day in court because the public defense system is broken. So like what you say, if you're mm-hmm. wealthy enough to get your own lawyer, you're probably not going to get the death penalty. You're probably, going to get some other option, maybe even get out on parole eventually.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
So we're talking about a matter of justice.
Absolutely.
In the way that it's being applied. Mm-hmm. And the fact of how many poor people are on death row, and DNA testing showing innocent people have been executed, mm-hmm. raises all these matters of justice, correct?
Yes, definitely. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, I'd like just to jump into another area. Mm-hmm. We've had on the program Dr. Steve Monsema, mm-hmm. who's been, a strong proponent of disposing of the death penalty.
Right.
And he's been a politician, but a teacher at Calvin College and so forth. Now, but his approach is kind of interesting. In the 80s, I think he was considered pretty far along in it, but now it strikes me as more of a moderate approach, because what he says, and I'd like to have your response to this, mm-hmm. is that life in prison is adequate justice and payback for murder. And so therefore he is in favor of life imprisonment, not the death penalty, but he seems to be in favor of life in prison for the same reason the people are in favor of the death penalty. Do you your head around what I'm saying?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in fact, I even talk with folks who sometimes say that they think life without parole is more of a deterrent because it's actually a more harsh punishment, which I think is also interesting. I think it's a tough question. I mean, I think life in prison is a very serious sentence. It's difficult, especially as a Christian, when I believe in redemption. But I certainly think that the death penalty is a very egregious example of us sort of giving up on a person, even if they've committed a really terrible crime, sort of saying that this person is disposable. And I just can't wrap my mind around that, I guess. I don't believe that a person is ever disposable, that God is ever done with a person until he takes them. And so I would favor life in prison as well. But I do think it's a tough question as far as accountability goes, when you're talking about life in prison is a serious sentence as well.
Yeah, I guess what I'm leaning is that I think life imprisonment would be better than the death penalty, but not because I think it is sufficient payback.
Sure.
I think the death penalty is raw payback. Okay? But at least life imprisonment allows the possibility for restorative
Absolutely.
things to happen, right?
Yes, definitely.
And so I would not like to, I'd like to take out the payback sort of idea. You know, in Hebrews, in Romans, it says that, you know, it's mine. God says it's mine to avenge,
That's
mine
right.
to repay.
That's right.
We do need to punish people, but I'd like to think we should do that in a restorative rather than a retributive sort of manner.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Definitely. I absolutely agree. And I've heard so many beautiful stories of restorative justice and redemption, even from people who have committed really terrible crimes, even people who've served time on death row, and who have become really wonderful human beings and done beautiful things inside the prison. And I know you all work with people who have stories like that every day. And I think, unfortunately, the public isn't always made aware of those stories. And I think we hear of the bad things that happen in prison. And so often we don't focus on the good things that can happen. But there are really, really beautiful things happening inside prison walls all across this country. And God is at work.
What's going on in California? They say that in California, that the number one cause of death on death row is old age.
That's right. Yes, they have the largest death row population in the country. They have a real problem on their hands in California. They have the largest death row population, yet they are releasing offenders because, not on death row, but who are in for other offenses because they can't afford to house them any longer. They have spent millions upon millions of dollars on these death row cases, and for what? So, you know, there was a measure on the ballot last year in California to work to end the death penalty, and it failed by a very small margin. But we're hopeful that Californians will wake up to what's really happening there and see that this is not worth the money they're spending alone, let alone all of the other issues. But there are a lot of issues in California, for sure, with the death penalty there.
How many Western countries have the death penalty?
Yeah, we're it. Just us. We stand alone.
Just we're the only one.
Yes.
You'd think that would speak to people to some extent, right?
That's right.
What happens to a murderer in Europe?
Yeah, well, and as far as I know, they don't have life without parole either. I don't think. So, you know, they do believe in restorative justice. They don't believe that that the criminal justice system is only meant to punish, but that it is meant to restore. That it's meant to rehabilitate. That it's meant to sort of help the person to become a better person instead of just putting them in a cell and forgetting about them and treating them poorly and then expecting them, if they are someday to be released, to magically become a well-functioning citizen. So I think you're right. I think they do a much better job than we do.
And we are the only enlightened country that still holds on to the death penalty.
That's right.
Yeah, that's an amazing thing. Well, I want to take a little break here, but I'd like to shift gears once again, and that is I want to talk about the victims.
Yes.
Because we don't want to at all lose track of the victims. Family members who have lost loved ones because of someone murdered them or killed them. You guys doing work in that area?
Yes, absolutely. We do a lot of work in that area. In fact, I said that we focus on ending the death penalty, which is true, but we're beginning a new program, and the focus of that program will be to really engage victims, family members, and victims of crime, and ask them sort of, what do you need after trauma? Because we find that question isn't being asked enough.
Let's talk about that.
Sure.
We'll be right back.
Are you in prison? Do you know someone who is? Through CBI Bible studies and encouragement from CBI instructors, more than 40,000 people behind bars are learning the truth about salvation through Christ and are developing deeper relationships with God. For an enrollment form, please visit us online at cbi.fm.
Welcome back to Crossroad Connection. I'm David Scheringa, and I'm here with Heather Bodwin, who works for Equal Justice USA. Do they have a website, Heather?
We do, absolutely. Please visit us. It's www.ejusa.org.
Okay, we'll have that on the screen too, so people can learn more about your work.
Great.
And you're concentrating on the death penalty right now, but before the break, I hinted, are you doing anything for the victims? Because it strikes me that, if a loved one of yours was murdered, you'd probably have a little different perspective on this, right?
Yes, definitely.
What's going on with helping victims?
Sure. And again, before I started this work, I would have wrongly assumed that that anyone who'd lost a loved one to homicide would certainly be in support of the death penalty, and I have found that that is absolutely false. There are so many victims' family members out there who have been lied to about what the death penalty actually entails. Many supported the death penalty when their loved one was taken from them, and they were promised closure and peace, and that that they would sort of feel better after this execution was carried out.
And they don't, do they?
No, they don't. Well, and oftentimes, as you pointed out, in California, these folks die of old age instead of being executed anyway. And so they're forced to go through this ridiculously long and painful process where the focus is mostly put on the offender, where the offender sometimes becomes sort of a celebrity. We care about their last meal and all of these things. Whereas if there's a different sentence that is not the death penalty, family members have found that they are much more able to sort of move on with their lives instead of being dragged through this appeals process that can last decades.
Once again, I think that has to go back to the fact that payback doesn't really work.
That's right.
It doesn't really work. The victims who watch the offender be killed, they don't feel better afterwards. But we have heard incredible stories where they've actually spoken with them and forgiven them.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
But that's a matter of restorative justice, right? Because that's not built into our system so much.
Right.
To actually be usually the victims and so forth become sort of irrelevant in this case against the state. And the most you see is, I think, is when the person is being sentenced. Then maybe some family members can be there to spout off something out of anger.
Right.
Am I speaking correctly?
Definitely. And sometimes, they're provoked even, and there are wonderful prosecutors out there. I used to work for one. And so I have a great deal of respect for the law enforcement in this country. But I think sometimes prosecutors wrongly use victims as sort of a pawn, to keep them angry and to keep their wounds open because they want to get a death penalty in this case. And that's really not helpful, obviously, for these folks who've lost loved ones to murder, and they need to be able to move on with their lives. And I've even heard of cases where the victim's family members did not want the death penalty and were very adamant about that, and the prosecutor said, "Too bad, we're going for it anyway," and so they had no choice in being drugged through this process. So that's harmful.
What can the average person do to get this on the radar, and maybe even to advocate against the death penalty?
Yes, definitely. Well, if you live in a state that has the death penalty, I would highly, highly suggest that you get in touch with us. We would love to work with you if you're interested in this issue at all. And certainly we can put you in touch with the state group on the ground who's working to end the death penalty. And every state has one. Even Michigan has a group because there were some efforts, I think, in the 90s to work to bring back the death penalty. So Michigan even still has an anti-death penalty group here. But that's the best thing that you can do is connect with your state group on the ground because they're the ones that are doing local work. But also get in touch with us. We can let you know what's happening nationally. We work in a variety of states across the country to end the death penalty and would love to engage you. So.
Well, that's great, and because people can be effective, right? If politicians hear from the grassroots,
there's no question
they'll pay attention to it because they're always working on the next election. Is that right?
Yes, it's true, and they want to hear from their constituents. And I found that I worked in the legislature here in Michigan and with legislators in Montana, and I think that folks are surprised. Legislators don't hear enough from their constituents, and it can really make a big impact.
As we close, just how did a young lady like you ever get interested in the death penalty?
That's a good question. It's of the Lord because I have no direct experience with the death penalty. But like I said, ever since I can remember, I've always been passionate about it. It was the issue that I wanted to research and debate, even in high school and college. And I remember my mom saying to me, why do we kill people who kill people to show that killing people is wrong? And as a child, that resonated with me. And then throughout my life, as I've learned more about the issue, I've just become much more passionate and have gotten to know death row exonerees and murder victims' family members and wardens who've participated in the execution process. And every one of their stories just compels me more to want to do this work.
Right. Well, it strikes me as we close that maybe those who are adamantly for the death penalty and those who are adamantly against it, and maybe even citing their own biblical evidence, it strikes me that if it is not, and we sort of began here, if it's not being administered justly,
right?
If innocent people are being put to death, if poor people are being put on death row, it seems like a reasonable compromise
right.
is that we put a moratorium on this form of punishment until it can be administered justly for all. Is
Right.
that asking too much?
I don't think so at all. And I think, there are states like Illinois who did just that, and who took time
You're right.
to study what was happening in their state and why were so many innocent people being convicted. And then they tried to craft this perfect death penalty, and we saw that in Maryland too, where they tried to craft a death penalty that would get it right. And in both of those states, they ended up ultimately abolishing the death penalty because they realized that even their perfect death penalty didn't work. And so I think there are lots of flaws in the system, but yes, I definitely think that we need to stop and take a look at what it's actually doing and decide, is it worth it with all these problems that you mentioned?
There's a prison in Louisiana run by a guy by the name of Burl Cain.
Yes.
You've heard of it?
Yes, definitely.
And they have, I've been there a few times, and they bring you to this room where they put people to death. And Burl Cain and others like to talk about the fact that he holds their hand when they are being killed and so forth.
I mean, as I briefly mentioned, I have gotten to know several wardens who at the time supported the death penalty and thought that what they were doing was just. And now many of them suffer from PTSD because they participated in this process that I think we as human beings are not wired or meant to do. And so I know one particular warden in Florida, he executed 6 people. And after he retired, he started waking up in the middle of the night and seeing all of them sitting at the foot of his bed. To
hold their hand is, you're saying, is almost a desperate attempt to somehow bring some sympathy to the situation or empathy, but there really is no right. There's no good answer for keep doing it, is it?
I don't believe there is.
Well, thank you very much, Heather.
No,
this has
thank you.
been a wonderful, wonderful time to talk to you about this very, very important issue of our day, and we wish you Godspeed as you continue to get the word out there. And hopefully we can at least find a compromise that we should not have a death penalty that's being disproportionately distributed among the poor.
Absolutely.
Because that's something that will make the prophets of the Bible roll over in their grave.
Yes, I would agree with you. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
You're very, very welcome. And thank you for being with us for another issue of Crossroad Connection, and we hope to see you again right here next week.